Good afternoon from beautiful Barcelona. I am Alexis Roch, CEO of SciTech Diplo Hub, the Science and Technology Diplomacy Hub. Thank you so much for joining us one more day for our SciTech Talks, a series of free online lectures that SciTech Diplo Hub and eBay have put forward together with other world-class institutions and leading international experts in science, diplomacy, and global affairs. In the last lectures, we discussed the significance of energy diplomacy in advancing nuclear fusion technologies, as well as the latest developments of health diplomacy as a tool for mitigating the silent pandemic of antimicrobial resistance. Today, we will delve into the topic of technology diplomacy to discuss the future of data privacy and its geopolitical dimension. In today's interconnected world, technology has completely transformed the way nations engage with each other and has influenced global power dynamics. While the integration of technology across diverse sectors has led to unprecedented advancements, it is clear that it has also created new challenges and new uncertainties that demand cooperation at the international level. As the influence of technology continues to grow, and as it does the geopolitical relevance of the main global tech companies, it has become crucial to establish new frameworks that address common concerns and foster shared goals. This is where science and technology diplomacy comes into play as a powerful tool that enables nations to navigate the complex landscape of international relations while harnessing the transformative potential of technology. In this context, the recent draft decision of the EU-US data privacy framework by the European Commission is a significant step towards effective cooperation in the technology sphere. And this decision could pave the way for a potential data transfer deal to be adopted next year, which would not only enhance data protection measures, but also promote greater collaboration and trust between nations. However, in order to finalize the agreement, it is essential to obtain approval from both European lawmakers and the EU Privacy Watchdog panel. And this is crucial for transatlantic data transfers because the two prior EU-US agreements, namely the Safe Harbor and the Privacy Shield, were invalidated by the highest court of the European Union. Data governance has emerged as a key topic in contemporary diplomatic agenda, and data is rising as a new relevant tool in foreign affairs. Today, we will delve deeper into how new technologies are reshaping contemporary geopolitics and the very practice of diplomacy. In particular, we will discuss the importance of data governance in international relations and how it's impacting the current bilateral relations between the US and the European Union. To shed light on this topic today, we are delighted to welcome a panel of world-class experts in data governance and tech diplomacy that will be moderated by Patricia Groover, co-founder at the Tech Diplomacy Network. Good morning, Patricia. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon and morning for us here on the East Coast of the US. So my name is Patricia Groover. I'm the co-founder of the Tech Diplomacy Network. And this network was built to capture and define the emerging field of tech diplomacy, particularly here in the United States and particularly in Silicon Valley. I'm also a former science diplomat, and I'm currently also working for New America on international digital governance, which includes this topic, data governance. So as Alexis mentioned, data can be defined as the oil of the 21st century, and the power of data to achieve breakthroughs in various fields and sectors is significant. According to the Diplo Foundation, data and diplomacy have three major interplays. Data shapes digital geopolitics. Data governance is a topic on the diplomatic agenda, and data is a tool that can be used in diplomacy. So we're going to focus, as Alexis mentioned, on data governance. And there are a few organizations, multilateral and international organizations that are tackling this problem. The OECD, ASEAN, the Council of Europe, and then there are also bilateral agreements such as the one between the US and the UK on data sharing. But some of these are focused more on one particular aspect of data governance, such as privacy or artificial intelligence. And my program at New America is focused on digital governance from a wider perspective. And we're also looking at it from the perspective of not just multilateral, but also multi-stakeholder. So including civil society organizations, academics, and people that have historically been excluded from these conversations, particularly those in the global South. And then, you know, to add to this mix and to think about some complications that are going to arise in these data governance discussions, particularly between the EU and the US, generative AI, such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, are going to pose an additional problem and an additional layer of complexity. So there's going to be a redefinition of public data and who gets to share it. Few trade agreements, except the US and Canada and the US and Australian model, suggest public data could be provided in a machine readable format, except for national security data. No trade agreement covers open data held by sources such as Wikipedia or others. And US courts have approved web scraping, although other countries have come to opposite conclusions. There's also concerns about interoperability, data sovereignty, and values. And then again, when we come back to the emerging generative AI, there are concerns in the developing world, and particularly about expropriation of resources. So when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about how ChatGPT, for example, is trained on copyrighted material, and it functions without access to that material. So there are concerns about how ChatGPT, in particularly, concentrates wealth for its owners' copyrighted work. So we're going to get into that a little bit later, but I wanted to introduce you all to our fabulous panelists. So first we have Gabriela Zanfir-Fortuna, Vice President for Global Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. Then we have Paul Rosenzweig, a professorial lecturer in law at George Washington University. And last but not least, we have Adria Rodriguez Perez, Data Protection Officer at CITL. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question to Gabriela. The US is experiencing a privacy renaissance with an increasing number of bills and initiatives being introduced to regulate privacy at the state and federal levels. This trend reflects a heightened concern among Americans for their privacy. Similarly, policymakers across the globe are also focused on improving privacy frameworks, with more than 120 countries having enacted privacy or data protection laws. What do you consider to be the main challenges faced in developing a privacy framework that is effective across different legal traditions and jurisdictions? And how can these challenges be addressed?
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's such an essential initiative, I would say, focusing a bit on tech and data diplomacy. That's such a wonderful idea, and I want to congratulate the organizers for picking up this thread, because I think it's absolutely important in this day and age. So just for a bit of background of this privacy renaissance that we're seeing in the US, and I have indeed used this term in an article published about 2 years ago, we are seeing many initiatives of all sorts of shapes and forms. I would say the most relevant wave that is happening at state level for the time being in the United States, where we have already this year 4 new states, the latest one being Tennessee, but then also Iowa and Montana, that actually proposed and passed baseline data protection privacy laws, or comprehensive, if we want to be generous with the term comprehensive. And this new wave from this year comes on top of the first state comprehensive data protection laws in the past 2 years, where we've seen California, first and foremost, that was the state that first passed such a law, and then Virginia, Connecticut, as other states, Colorado, of course, they have quite a strong law as well. So now we are at about 9 states in the United States that have passed this type of laws, which is quite remarkable because the United States has been, let's say, a bit slower in adopting this type of laws that govern how personal information, digital data that can be traced back to an individual should have rules in place in ensuring that the other rights of the individual are respected, that they should be treated fairly, there should be no discrimination there, and so on. These laws are quite inspired by the GDPR, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. Now, there is a very rich history in data protection law that goes back several decades, and that has the US and the EU doing a bit of a ping pong of ideas on how to best deal with the new computerized age and the new massive databases that were being created, in the 60s, the 70s, and all of the technical revolution that came afterwards. And I think that now we're seeing one of the most significant moments in time in this history here in the United States. The challenge, though, is that the United States does not have yet a comprehensive federal privacy law. And I think it's not at all difficult for anyone to see that having piecemeal regulation in the states here might actually eventually be detrimental to developing new products and technology, and having tools that are out there, such as generative AI, as you mentioned it, because we'll have different rules governing how data can be collected, how it can be shared. We'll have all sorts of different types of carve-outs for different industries. And I think we are soon going to have quite a mess from this point of view. That's the main challenge here in the United States. I would say the fact that unfortunately we do not yet have a federal comprehensive data privacy legislation. There have been a lot of steps taken in this direction in the past years, but unfortunately not yet successful. And we don't know exactly what are the chances. There are still chances there for a bill to advance in Congress. After last year, we had the most promising bill, the ADPPA, that has been proposed in the past decade. So this is a bit of the big picture in the US, and what's happening in the rest of the world is that we are seeing comprehensive data protection laws being proposed and passed in very significant jurisdictions. And I will give you a key example. For instance, right now, there are very serious continuous debates in India, which is, a country of 1+ billion people, the biggest democracy in the world. And India has been working for the past 4 years or so quite seriously to pass a comprehensive data protection law. And there are signs that efforts will be concentrated in the second part of the year to see this happening. At the same time, we have seen jurisdictions like Indonesia that passed a comprehensive data protection law last year, one of the most populous countries in the world as well. We are seeing many countries in Africa that are passing such laws. Australia right now is in the middle of completely renewing, updated their law from the 80s, the Privacy Act. So very similar movements everywhere to ensure that in this new digital age, and especially when everything is turbocharged or about to be turbocharged by generative AI and the new tools being developed right now, ensuring that the rights of individuals and the rights of their communities in the end will be safeguarded to at least to a certain extent against abuse, discrimination, and so forth. I would say this is the very big picture, and then I will end by mentioning that a key challenge that I see in this landscape is the fact that technology very rarely has borders. And if we come up, we have technically at the global level the same problem we have in the US with the very different regimes that appear. Well, not very different, but right, different regimes that appear everywhere. I think that while they have a lot in common, they have a lot of principles in common, as data minimization, purpose limitation, and I'm very happy to go into the geekiness of it because it's one of my favorite topics in the world. But they do also have some differences. And that's the biggest challenge. You know, technology does not have borders. I think we should be able at one point to come up with commonly agreed rules on how data should go through technology and what types of impacts we want in our societies and for our rights. I will stop here with my first remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. I totally agree with you that, you know, technology is not confined to national borders, and so there should be international cooperation around data governance. The next question is for Paul. In an era of unparalleled technological advancement, cyber warfare has become a critical factor in modern conflict, raising significant concerns about the rules of engagement. The escalating use of malware and other cyber weapons poses a significant threat to the security and privacy of personal data. As a result, individuals and organizations alike face serious repercussions from the potential consequences of cyber attacks. What steps do you think the US and EU should take to protect their citizens and businesses from cyber attacks? How do you see the vulnerabilities of cyber warfare affecting the scope of the US-EU data privacy framework?
Well, thanks for the question, Patricia. And like Gabriela, I want to thank the SciTech Diplo Hub for inviting me to join you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I do have to note one correction to the title of this talk at the beginning, which is that you called it the EU-US Data Privacy Framework. And over here, we call it the US-EU Framework. And I say that as a joke, but it does sort of reflect the fact that there are differing perspectives across the Atlantic between the US and the EU. I'm particularly delighted to be talking to you today about security and privacy as we move to implement the framework that President Biden and the European Union agreed to last year. It's taking its time in becoming a reality, but I think we are on the cusp of a major change in the way that the US and the EU interact on privacy issues. And my particular subtopic today is to discuss the intersection of privacy and security in the transatlantic space in a world where cyber war, and I would add cyber crime, are exploding as risks and vulnerabilities. So I'd like to make 4 points in my initial intervention here. One of them is sort of philosophical, one of them is technical, and the last 2 are diplomatic and policy and law oriented. First, the philosophy point. Gabriela spoke about the ping-ponging nature of the discussion about privacy across the Atlantic, and I would call it the convergence of thinking about privacy in the commercial data space. I don't see that same convergence happening in the national security law enforcement space at nearly the same pace, and it may never actually converge. And part of that is that at bottom, there's a dissonance between how Europeans view privacy and how Americans view privacy. I'm not telling you anything new, but when I say that in Europe, privacy is a normative value, it's a human right. In America, it's much more, especially in the security space, seen as a deontological or operative value. Privacy is an important thing, but it stands in equipoise with security concerns. Thus, here we tend, at least in the security space, to think of consequences rather than violations vel non. And that lack of coherent agreement across the transatlantic has impeded cooperation on cybersecurity measures. It's impeded cooperation on law enforcement. And as a consequence, the spillover effect has been that it's impeded the development of commercial data sharing agreements across the Atlantic as well. So I'm not sure if that philosophical agreement matters that much in the long run, if we can reach operational agreements that are effective for both sides in validating their concerns. But it's important to kind of start with recognizing that we begin from slightly different places, which is sort of why I joked about the US-EU versus EU-US name for the framework. The second point I would make, which is a technical one in nature, which is also a backgroundy step, is that in the security space, anonymity and privacy are, well, I won't say they're the enemy of security, but they are a challenge to maintaining secure environments. In some fundamental ways, secure spaces that are safe for personal data of individuals or for national security secrets or law enforcement secrets can't be fully private spaces. We can recognize pseudonymous activity there, but truly anonymous activity, truly private activity that is not subject to security scrutiny is in many ways an impossibility to achieve in terms of true security. And that suggests to me that in the long run, we're going to have to hive off certain secure areas where privacy is less well recognized than it is in the general commercial data space. The last points I would make are diplomatic and policy oriented. I am very optimistic that the data privacy framework that has been signed between the US and the EU will go a long way towards resolving some of these technical and philosophical problems I've identified. On the EU side, the Europeans and European data people are getting two, I think, pretty significant concessions from the United States in the security space. The first is self-imposed limits on the US intelligence community's gathering and use of commercial data. That's never been done before in the United States, which historically refuses to acknowledge such limits on its activity beyond what's imposed by generally agreed upon international law precepts. So this is a big gain for Europeans and European diplomacy. The second is access to a data privacy review court, which granted is not the American Article 3 legal system, but as I've argued in some of the things I've written, it's actually superior in some ways because it'll be more likely to get European substantive resolution of their claims rather than procedural limitations on their claims. In return, the U.S. is going to seek assistance, concessions from Europe to be deemed qualifying countries with access to these benefits, and those are going to include IC assistance and law enforcement assistance, and cross-Atlantic commercial data transfers under an adequacy determination. My final point, and I'll end here, is that I think that this new framework may very well be the last best chance for a comprehensive resolution of the tensions, the ping-pongingness between the US and the EU. From my perspective, the US has gone about as far as it can go, and the Europeans seem to have gone about as far as they are willing to go as well. If this agreement likewise falls afoul of the European court system, I'm not sure that there's a recoverable solution ahead of us. And with that, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Patricia.
Thanks for that in-depth analysis, Paul. And it's great to hear about the state of play with the framework and the concessions being made on both sides. So now I'm going to turn it over to Adria. The EU-US data privacy framework has sparked intense debate regarding its adequacy in protecting personal data. In light of the greater prevalence of cyber attacks and data breaches, experts are calling for increased transparency and stronger protections, in particular among economic operators. However, achieving consensus on these issues is challenging, with policymakers facing trade-offs like the ones Paul mentioned between privacy and economic interests. How can international businesses navigate the complexities of data protection regulations when operating in multiple countries? What measures can be implemented to uphold the security and transparency of the data transfer processes?
Thank you. Allow me to join the round of thanks. It's great to be here today in such an important initiative discussing the data diplomacy. It's not so often that we found these spaces to discuss this topic, and more interestingly, to have so many different stakeholders involved, like from the for-profit sector that I'm representing today, as well as from academia and NGOs. So thank you for the opportunity. I have to confess that my intervention is gonna get closer to a pessimistic note regarding the future of US-European Union data transfers for several reasons, and maybe because we're experiencing now the consequences of SREMS too. But first, I would like to make a couple of clarifications regarding data processing rules in Europe. First, I would like to clarify that data is anything that relates to an identified or identifiable individual. That has specific consequences because it's not only private or confidential data that is under the scope of the GDPR, but also actually any data that we as companies process, which is openly public, or that's not something that we tend to keep secret, like our CVs that we've shared today will be, of course, personal data, but also other information that people willingly give us, like email addresses for newsletter subscriptions, or even the cookies that process information about website visitors. All of these fall under the scope of the GDPR. This is the first clarification that I wanted to make. The second is what relates to the processing of this personal data, because we usually think that, well, only accessing, storing, manipulating personal data is under the scope of the GDPR. But it's interesting to see that when we speak about international transfers, merely accessing personal data from abroad is already processing, and it's therefore under the scope of the GDPR. So that means that any activity that we do with personal data, it's currently at stake, because as I'm sure you well know, since 2020, the privacy shield that allowed for the free flow of personal data between the US and the European Union was struck by the European Court of Justice, at the Court of Justice of the EU. This has had terrible consequences for private operators. Obviously, we still have tools to transfer personal data and engage economically with companies and other kind of organizations. It's not just for economic purposes that GDPR applies. But even if the Court of Justice of the EU did not declare, for instance, standard contractual clauses as being illegal, it imposed additional burdens on the processing of personal data and on the engagement of non-EU operators through standard contractual clauses, or even binding corporate rules, which are other mechanisms that can be in place for specific transfers between smaller groups of operators. Where the privacy shield allowed the free flow of exchanges of data, these mechanisms that are foreseen in Article 46 of the GDPR can still be used, but the Court of Justice of the EU says those who export personal data abroad need to make sure that they are by themselves enough. And if they're not enough, they need to adopt additional measures, supplementary mechanisms, a round of very nice mechanisms that they do not specify. So we found ourselves data processors who had maybe the need to export personal data, because in the case of Cytel, the company where I work, we have an office there, or we work with customers there who want to know who is managing their projects. So we found ourselves in the situation to say, well, now if we want to continue doing that, we need to agree on standard contractor clauses. But in order to know if these standard contractor clauses are enough, we need to start evaluating not just the legal framework on personal data of the country where we want to export, but even the practice itself, and then decide which additional mechanisms should be put in place. Obviously, without anyone telling what this consisted on. When the European Data Protection Board decided to come up with a recommendation on how to evaluate the need for these additional measures, I think they were surely inviting us to stop making any transfers of personal data, because the kind of mechanisms or assessments that one organization has to undergo, it's insane. From analyzing the rule of law in the country, obviously the legal framework, the compliance of all the surveillance mechanisms that exist in that country. I'm a political scientist and specializing in law, and I found that self-cumbersome. I cannot imagine smaller companies or smaller NGOs or even some public administrations having to do that for each engagement with an operator abroad. So understand my pessimism. Having said that, the new framework is appreciated, but I'm not optimistic either about its future. The European Data Protection Board released or adopted a document with their opinion on the topic. They really acknowledge the advancements and the changes in the framework in the US, given the executive order that was signed at the end of the last year, but they are still reluctant. And the reluctance relies mostly not so much on the issue of surveillance. Actually, even the Court of Justice of the EU itself shifted the focus from Schrems 1 to Schrems 2, from the idea of surveillance to the lack of guarantees that data subject has when it comes to the processing of their data. So I don't think that is solved yet. And even if this moves forward, well, it's likely that we may have a Schrems 3 or maybe even another mechanism that renders this framework illegal. So what I will try to suggest humbly in terms of what can be done is first to start understanding that the development of new standards, which are necessary in order to ensure our right to personal data protection and to privacy, are combined with other mechanisms. When it comes to norms about state behavior online and in cyberspace, there is a overall consensus that it's not just adopting norms and standards, it's also an issue of capacity building measures. I would like to see the EU and maybe the US working on that to make sure that both public administrations and private actors are sure not just to understand the law and implement it, but also adopt the technical mechanisms that may be necessary to securely transfer data and continue making their transactions of any sort. If we don't have that, we risk not just hurting international trade or wealth more broadly, but even stifling competition, because in the end, with these new rules and without any capacity building measures, what we tend to see is a concentration of power on big tech corporations who are precisely whom we want to be protected against when it comes to processing of personal data. So food for thought on that matter.
Thank you, Adria, for providing that alternative perspective on the future of the EU-US privacy framework. And so this question is for all of the panelists. With the rise of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies, how do you think the data privacy frameworks will need to evolve to protect individuals' rights and mitigate risks while allowing for innovation and technological development? How can governments work together to ensure that data privacy protections are consistent across borders?
Let me indeed start with that one, because this is absolutely a topic that has been occupying my head for the past weeks intensively. And in fact, I was just in New York 2 days ago at the New York University for a symposium particularly on generative AI and GPT and the GDPR and the future of regulation in this space. I would say that it seems that we are indeed at an inflection point with everything that we are seeing out there in terms of the capacity of this new and the capabilities of this new technology. However, the history of data protection law as it started in the 60s and the 70s shows us that in a way this is exactly why it was started. And one of the favorite things of mine as a researcher was to read about the debates in parliaments in the Western European countries and in the United States back in the 70s, when everyone was so concerned about the computer and what a mighty computer might achieve in the future, that they actually thought about coming up with a new branch of law. And this is how data protection actually got created. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn from back then. Now, even the very, very smart people that were working on this back then acknowledged that this new branch of law, data protection that we're talking about now, might have generations of development, just like technology might have generations of development. And they were proposing a set of rules and principles. They were defining processing in a specific way. They were trying to foresee the type of problems or issues or challenges an almighty computer and almighty processing of vast amounts of data might actually bring to society. The law has evolved in the past decades, and perhaps it's the time to see a new evolution. But my ask for the community would be to not come up with a whole new thing, like a whole new thing on AI and ethics and just work on what we have and the decades of thinking we have around this, even though it was not enough. There was not enough scholarship, I would say, on this new branch of law. But let's not come up with a whole new thing. Let's work with what we have and make it strong enough to protect people, but also make it smart enough to allow for this type of innovation, but at a secure, safe pace, and in such a way that it will bring the incredible potential that it has to improve our lives and our society, without impeding it, but at the same time also without allowing it to just run rampant out there and sort of create misinformation at a pace that we will not be able to cope with. So that would be my take on this particular moment. I'm very curious about my co-panelists and what their opinion.
Where I was optimistic about transatlantic data privacy, more optimistic, I think, than my colleagues on the panel, I am very pessimistic about the prospects for data privacy under the pressure of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence development. Traditional ideas about notice, control, storage limitations, use limitations are all under great stress. I mean, the very notion of AI in some ways is the lack of predictability, for example, in how it will use data and put things together to create new information responses for people. I mean, ChatGPT is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of AI. And in many ways, the rush towards AI is going to stress and possibly fracture a lot of our privacy facing concerns in ways that will make our current issues seem trivial. I'm also not optimistic, sadly, about the possibilities of international regulation or limitations of any sort. The US and the EU, who are the likely allies in this, have been struggling over privacy ideas for 20 years. AI is just going to fracture that and break it apart even more. And the idea that we can develop a framework, even if we are successful in doing so, that would meaningfully restrict how authoritarian nations like China and Russia use AI, or even nations in the third world like Saudi Arabia or South Africa or Brazil, is I think a real stretch. So I am unhappy in predicting a challenge, a deep challenge in Western consensus on regulatory structures that will be effective and not stifle innovation. And second, on whether or not anything that we might come up with will meaningfully impact a global development of AI. In some ways, I fear that the inflection point we're at right now is a lot like the inflection point with the development of social media, 10, 15 years ago, where the technology ran so fast ahead of regulation that we got all of these malicious instantiations of how social media propagated across the globe, bringing with it disinformation, bringing with it aggregations of malicious and malevolent conduct in ways that we've not seen before. And regulation is only just now catching up with that problem. And I'm guessing that AI is going to be much the same. I know that that's really grim, and I'm sorry about that, but that's sort of the way I see it. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Patricia, or pass it along.
I couldn't agree more with my co-panelists here. Continuing with my pessimistic note regarding with what Gabriela said, it's true. I don't think we need to even reinvent data protection regulations at all. The GDPR provides a good set of principles of how personal data should be processed, and additional protections when it comes to automated decision making and profiling. So the foundations, the legal foundations, are there, and if implemented properly, then maybe we could have already a solution to AI and generative AI. The problem is that we don't have the capabilities to ensure that. So how can we as citizens know if we are being profiled or considered apt or not apt for a job position or a mortgage or a health insurance or whatever? That's completely out of our ability to monitor when these systems are generalized to almost any kind of decision being made by public administration or public operators. And so obviously we will lose a lot of the control there. I think here, though, there could be more room for cooperation, not only at the transatlantic level. In this regard, for instance, one of the optimistic notes by the European Data Protection Board is the acknowledgement in the new draft framework of decisions that provide accountability when it comes to automated decision making. The thing again is to know how we can know that we have been profiled or targeted by actors who are not willing to to comply with these rules, no? And that sometimes the example of social media, it's very good, touched not just at data protection, but at the core of our political and civil rights. If we're being shown certain political information, or if we are being targeted with disenfranchisement campaigns, as we've seen in the US, not to vote, how can we as users make sure that those who provide the algorithms that allow us to be targeted because we belong to specific certain groups are actually going to be accountable about the kind of data that they've processed to build their models. I think here, more cooperation from the US and the European Union on explainable AI, accountable AI, algorithmic auditing could be a good way to approach this, and possibly even exporting some of the legal principles that, according to the European Data Protection Board now, and what Gabriela, of course, said, now seem to be renascing in the US. All in all, however, I would like to borrow one of the sentences by Gabriela at the beginning of her talk, that technology very rarely has borders. So AI very rarely has borders as well. And again, if we see that countries, even in the EU at the national level, continue to try to adopt policies by themselves, first, they will not succeed, and second, they will create a patchwork that will render any regulation useless. So in this regard, in Europe, we've seen a concerted effort by the European Data Protection Board to respond to ChatGPT, but that has not prevented national data protection authorities to recommend the adoption of specific measures in order not to declare its use contrary to data protection laws.
Thank you for all of those answers. They were really informative. And, this kind of leads into the next question, about trade-offs between maintaining citizens' protections, but also promoting innovation. So how do we do that? So one of the questions from the audience, most digital services platforms, social media networks, streaming companies, online marketplaces make large amounts of revenue, largely thanks to commercializing data from their users. How can states legislate in a way that protects their citizens' privacy without hindering competitiveness?
I can try to take a first stab at it. I see the question here in the chat. Let me have a second look. How can states legislate in a way that protects their citizens' privacy without hindering competitiveness? Well, this is, of course, the golden question, right? And it's been a very difficult golden standard to achieve. The EU, of course, has a sort of the advantage here because it's a wonderful creator and also exporter of regulation. I think what sets the European Union apart, particularly in this conversation and with this question on monetizing personal data and creating value from personal data and profits, is that the EU has this very unique approach, which starts not to be that unique anymore, but very important approach of considering that the protection of personal data is a fundamental right that people have. And this is actually quite significant in terms of how the EU then, in secondary legislation, in regulations, in directives, and so forth, is thinking about these issues. Now, we have this right in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, but we're starting to see, and actually this is something that I can say is necessarily novel. There have been some constitutions outside of the European space that have recognized data protection as a separate fundamental right than privacy. But we're starting to see it still happening with Brazil last year, including the right to data protection within the constitutional rights of the people there. And I'm mentioning this because the European Union, with this approach, pushes regulatory measures that try to temper or that go a bit against the idea that data is an exploitable good, let's say. And they're trying to come up with all sorts of frameworks, including some very new ones like the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, with the Digital Markets Act actually being particularly influential when we're talking about competitiveness on digital markets. That try to strike this balance. Now, let's see if this will be managed as a result. I don't know, but I thought that bringing up this approach that the EU is having towards these issues would contribute to the debate here. I'll stop here.
If I may add here, I think that the EU approach has finally proven to be adequate also in changing how, for example, big corporations process our personal data. Okay, it's been many years since 2016 that the GDPR was adopted, and since 2018 that it entered into force. But finally, we've seen some decisions or fines imposed on Meta and its subsidiaries for the legal grounds that they were using to process our personal data. And as a result of that, well, they don't consider no longer legitimate a contractual basis that in order to access their services, they can do whatever they want with our data. Of course, these are big corporations and they have huge armies of legal counsels and can move through that. But we see that now, thanks to this possibly culture of data protection, also we see NGOs helping citizens complain against the use of our personal data as a legitimate source based on the last changes by the Meta Group. So at the beginning, maybe it was just an example of, well, companies are going to be able to survive that because they will pay the fines, even if they're huge, 4% of revenue or up to 20 millions, whatever is higher. But we see that finally they're changing a bit on that. And I would say part of this is the way that GDPR has been approached, but also the fact that it's a 27 member states market. So if this extends to other countries, if the Brussels effect spillovers into non-EU member states, that will also give more power to states to make the rules, impose the rules even on digital operators who operate from elsewhere. So that's very interesting, very, very positive.
Paul, would you like to weigh in?
I don't think I have anything to add to this particular topic, except perhaps to say that I think both Adria and Gabriela are overly optimistic about the possibility that European data privacy rules will propagate across the globe. I think in much of the rest of the world, it's seen as a bit of privacy imperialism, and I suspect it certainly won't take hold in nearly the same way outside of the liberal small L West small W. But yeah, that's just a predictive judgment.
Great, thank you. We have another question from the audience. From the developing countries with large populations and economies, such as Brazil and India, which of the US, EU, and China has the best techno-political offering?
Well, I'll start with that one, and I'll say it's definitely not China. Don't take them as your model unless you want to, advance an authoritarian structure. And if there are any Chinese people on listening in, I sort of apologize, but I don't apologize for calling it as I see it. As between Europe and the United States, early on, Gabriela suggested that a unity of regulatory structures is better for advancing innovative development because it gave people one regulatory target to shoot at. In the end, I actually think that the opposite is true, that competing models is better because competition develops innovation in ways that top-down rationale from Brussels, just or from Washington for that matter, just isn't as effective in it's much less nimble, and in this environment, nimbleness is required. So I actually would say don't choose, pick and choose the pieces that are best across the two of them. Just don't choose the Chinese model.
I'm happy to weigh in here as well, because this is definitely something else that occupies a lot of my thinking space. And it's, the obvious answer would be the one that Professor Paul said earlier. But if we're looking at the reality of the new world, we cannot ignore the fact that China has actually been a first mover in particularly regulating generative AI. They came up with a draft regulation 2 weeks ago that's quite substantial. And then, of course, we are all wondering, what is behind the words on the paper. But before wondering whether there's heft and weight in that, we have to acknowledge that China has been actually quite active in producing a regulation on these issues. And I can't get past a remark that I've heard at this symposium I was just mentioning at the New York University School of Law by Mark Rothenberg. He's leading an NGO here in the US on AI governance. And who said that his sense is that Beijing is wondering, looking at the Brussels effect and this effect which saw the GDPR actually being replicated and around the world and inspiring so many laws around the world in data protection. Well, Mark was saying that perhaps Beijing is wondering, what if we would create a Beijing effect? Let's see, would that ever work? And it's not that they're not trying. So this last development with the generative AI draft regulations that have been published by the Cyberspace Administration, the CAC, that's just the last element of it, the most recent. We have seen regulations targeting deep fakes. We have seen rules targeting algorithmic recommendations. And this came on top of the PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law of China. Now, I think everyone should look at this package of things that are happening in the regulatory space from China, of course, questioning what's behind the words. Is there really meaning? What are there really rights that are being protected? But this is not saying that we should not be paying attention and we should not recognize that there is a lot of sort of movement that's happening there. And absolutely, it's something that we should be paying attention to. And I recognize also that our audience is also paying attention to when I'm seeing a question like this. Now, of course, my personal hope is that liberal democracies and freedom and systems of actual protecting human rights will be the ones that will be considered a model for the whole world. And I'll stop here.
Adria, do you have anything to add?
No, there's nothing I could add, actually. Yeah, it's nothing.
Great. Well, I really want to thank our panelists today for this really great and important discussion. With everything going on with generative AI and all these, different governance discussions happening all over the world, it's great to see people come together and, talk about what's going on, and being able to share that with all of you has been fantastic. So I'm going to give the floor back to Alexis, who will wrap up the session.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for the moderation, and thank you, Gabriela, Paul, and Adria, for this enriching enriching and sometimes very realistic conversation. There is no doubt that in a world that is becoming increasingly digital and data-driven, effective science and tech diplomacy is essential for governments to collaborate on establishing common standards, frameworks for data protection and data transfer. And as we have seen today, this is particularly important given this rapid pace of technological change, and as we were discussing, the need to balance innovation and growth with the protection of individual rights and privacy. For the last weeks, we have discussed the role of science and technology diplomacy to tackle global health, the green energy transition, and the role of data diplomacy in times of geopolitical realignment. In case you missed any of the sessions, we invite you to watch them on our YouTube channel. This year, our exciting talks reached a total live audience of over 900 people from 60 different countries. So it seems clear that science and technology diplomacy are here to stay. Before we wrap up, I would like to take this opportunity to remind you that if you would like to get certified in science and technology diplomacy, applications for our summer school are still open. This unique immersive training will take place the first week of July in the heart of beautiful Barcelona. This university program, organized by SciTech Diplo Hub and eBay, together with other leading institutions, will allow you to build your knowledge and skills in science and tech diplomacy and further your career into some of the topics we have been discussing in these online lectures at the intersection of science, technology, and foreign affairs, including climate change, cybersecurity, AI diplomacy, global health, sustainable development, and the study of how different countries and organizations approach these emerging and fascinating topics. If you're interested, don't hesitate to apply now. Thank you again one more year for joining us and making these SciDip talks possible. We hope you enjoyed them, and we look forward to seeing some of you very soon in Barcelona for our summer school. Thank you so much.